Thank you so much. This talk is based on an article that was published in August, just a few months ago, about sizing and forecasting in Scrum. So this is specifically aimed at Scrum. There are lots of different approaches for sizing, and there was a bit of debate in Scrum.org about this, and then I started reaching out to the no estimates community, Kanban communities, product communities, and so on, to find out what the lie of the land is. What are people doing in relation to sizing and forecasting? What are the latest trends? And what are the upsides and downsides to all of these? The full article is on InfoQ if you want to check it out. We're just going to do a speedy look at some of the options. So first thing is, I'm not sure if you realized yet, but 2 years ago they took the word estimate out of the Scrum Guide. It now refers to size or sizing. And personally, I think it might have been influenced by the Kanban Guide for Scrum Teams, which came out in 2018, because you can now do Scrum and then you can add Kanban to your Scrum. And so you get the best of both of them. And in Kanban, we have metrics, and I saw some metrics on the screen a while ago, which is great. And so you've got cycle time, lead time, throughput, all these kind of things. I have a feeling it was influenced by that. The word forecast is still there. And some people still think that burn-ups and burn-down charts are still required in Scrum, but actually they're not. And you can use any approach as long as it's supporting empiricism. Empiricism is where essentially you're deciding what to do next based on the evidence or learnings of what you did last. So is estimation dead is the question we're going to tackle today. And so before we talk about that, let's just look at sizing. So some caveats: the people who do the work do the sizing, nobody else. In Scrum, those people are called developers. I think it's one little regret that maybe the authors of the Scrum Guide might have. That word developer is still in the Scrum Guide. It was originally written for software development, but the 2020 changes were intended for people to go beyond the world of software. And complex work is uncomparable. So when you deal with complexity, what's in front of you is really not known. And so also I would say, if you're not in the habit of kind of cleaning up the mess behind you, think of cleaning up the kitchen at home and the dishes just all piling up. If you do that with your work as well, that will have an effect as well. No matter what sizing approach you use, you leave a mess behind you and it's going to catch up with you eventually. The most popular sizing approaches are based on either guesstimates or data, and we're going to talk about that later on, because a lot of people think, you need to have data-driven planning and so on. You might be interested in some of the insights I have around that. Some options, the popular options: relative estimation, the oldest one that's been around; flow metrics, new kid on the block in the Scrum world since 2018; right sizing, which is also influenced by Kanban. The idea of right sizing is, if you have a sprint, for example, and it's 2 weeks long, when you bring an item in, you just look at, well, does this item fit within a sprint according to our definition of done? We don't worry so much, is it a small or small, medium or medium? As long as it fits within the sprint, that's all we're looking for. And the no estimates community have been quite vocal as well in terms of, do you ever estimate? So I reached out to Woody Zool and Vasco Duarte and various other people in the estimates community to try to find out what was going on there, what's in common with Kanban, and what's different. So the Kanban flow metrics: work in progress, the number of items that you've started that you haven't finished yet. Work item age, probably the most important metric I would say, is when you look at a card on a board, how old is it? Has it been stewing around since August, for example? Have you been chasing all the new shiny balls but not finishing the old ones? When you look after your age, that looks after your cycle times. And you don't need to be a genius to figure out if your cycle times come down or stabilize, eventually your throughput will stabilize or hopefully go up. So we'll be talking about this later in the talk as well. Some charts. On the right-hand side, you've got a cycle time scatter plot. And this team at the start, their cycle times were going up. Coronavirus wasn't good to my family, but I like to see the humor in everything. And it's not quite coronavirus wave 1 at the start of that, but it's kind of going in the wrong direction. If your cycle times are going up, it's generally not good for flow. Also, what you can observe as well on the left-hand side of that chart is that the density of the dots, every one of those is an item that could deliver to done. The density is going down left to right until they change the way they operate. And I've seen this hundreds of times, where I do this with real teams, I do it in simulations as well. And what the team did was, at the start, they were pushing work in even before they had the capacity to take on that work. But on the right-hand side, what happened was, even though all these emergency things were coming in, they understood that it was faster to leave it on the backlog, focus and finish. And because you're doing it so quickly, believe it or not, it's quicker to leave something on the backlog, and then when you come in, you just suck it in and it goes straight through. So this team did this, and on the right-hand side, the red items, they were blocked, which means they had problems. So even when they were blocked, they were faster. So their cycle times halved, their throughput tripled. They had a third of an item per day on average, and went up to one item per day. There's also a chart there called a work item aging chart, which is only available on Actionable Agile tool, which is a commercial tool, but you can use it as a standalone piece of software as well, so you can import data from other areas. But even if you don't have that tool, what I like about this is when you look at a card, you say, well, how old is this card versus that card? Oh, we need to look at the older one, then which one is blocked? Let's try to unblock that. But what's nice about this chart is that you might see that there's an item in an earlier column on the board that it kind of looks harmless. It's only 6 days old, but actually for that column, it should have been out of there 4 days ago. So you need to be careful with that. Okay, then relative estimation. So time reference is an option. I was quite surprised when I was trained by Bas Vada, the large-scale Scrum trainer, and I guess co-creator of large-scale Scrum. He prefers to use time reference. I was really surprised about that. Now, I'm not talking about ideal time. You know, when you hear people saying, oh, how long is that going to take? It's going to be like 2 ideal days. I mean, when have you ever had an ideal day, right? So I didn't even bring that into the presentation. This is about items from the past. So yeah, actually that feels like something we did a year ago. And yeah, that took about 2 weeks. You don't remember that you estimated 3 story points, so that you said it was going to take 2 days. You remember that it took 2 weeks. So the genius move from that actually is that waiting time is included, which is really cool. You can assign numeric values, which is the most common approach. The common scale is the Fibonacci scale, the combination of the last 2 numbers. You can also use playing cards. I personally find that wasteful. Takes too long. I was in a telecoms company one day. We spent 7 hours estimating the whole backlog. Then we used an alternative approach, 15 minutes, same answer. I haven't done that approach since 2016. You can use t-shirt sizing, which is kind of a shortcut to the same thing. Essentially, people convert those sizes into story points or something like that usually, so it ends up in numbers anyway. But it's a quicker way of doing it. And wall estimation is a riff on that. Much easier, so you could imagine your product backlog all on the wall, you've got all these cards, or you could have it on a table, and you get the team to silently move the items around. Which ones are the smallest items? Any other ones like that? Any other ones? No, okay. Okay, let's go up to the next one. Medium, yeah, that one. What, any other ones? Yeah, that one. And so 20 minutes later, whole wall estimated. And what's good about wall estimation is you don't just estimate effort, you can also estimate value. We don't really know the value, it's all relative. We won't know until we actually deliver something. We're trying to get some idea of the potential value. It might help you with your ranking value divided by effort, if that makes sense. Relative estimation comes in different flavors, and if you estimate, the best thing that can happen is you're right. They're usually wrong. I would say 99% of the time they're wrong. Be very careful about averages. There's a book called The Flaw of Averages. Did you know that 50% of people perform below average? It's a joke, right? 50-50. And Dave Snowden here, when I had him on my podcast, he was saying to me that the average of independent blind assessments can actually be pretty much spot on. The thing is that when Scrum teams do sizing, do they do it blind, or are they all facing each other, showing cards and so on? So if you don't estimate at all, maybe you just save loads of time. Now, that's something we're going to talk about later. So what is right sizing? Well, even when Kanban was added to Scrum, and even though we could look at that cycle time scatter plot we had a while ago, and let's say we knew that based on the data, 85% of items are done in 18 days or less, we're not complete idiots, right? We know that some things are elephants. So you don't bring an elephant into a sprint, right? So with right sizing, all you say is, well, does this feel like one of these items we can do in 18 days or less, or whatever the length of your sprint is? And that's essentially what it does. And what I really like about right sizing is we don't get so worried about, is it a small or small, medium? Or the poor product owner, her head is exploding. There's so many items because we made the items also small. And what's kind of nice about right sizing is we have a backlog that's more understandable, I guess. Then no estimates. When I spoke to Vasco Duarte, what he looks for is across your product backlog, he looks for a distribution of different sizes. So if you did have mediums, larges, things like that, he tries to distribute that throughout the whole backlog. Whereas the Kanban folks and the Scrum folks, they tend to focus more on the items at the top of the backlog. We need to right size those. We're not so worried about the ones below. But because they're using rolling wave forecasting in no estimates, they need to make sure that the numbers aren't skewed, so they're trying to have some refinement down below, so there's a bit of a mix and match as well. They count runnable, or so running tested stories, same thing as done product backlog items, I guess, except you're kind of getting a slice of cake. You're getting that value from those teams. They also use right sizing, and they slice their items down into 24-hour or 48-hour chunks. That's good because, in my view, 60 to 90% of items should never be built. 60 to 90%. So if you do some discovery, do some cheap experiments, and Vasco says, well, you need to chop this down. Well, how can I chop it down? Well, how about you talk to the customer and reconfirm that business problem? Is that really the right problem to focus on right now? And who are we targeting? And what are their problems? Are they just complaining? My brother, I call him a happy moaner. He likes to moan. And so I know he's happy when he's moaning. Sometimes that happens with our customers as well. Sometimes they have a satisfactory workaround and they'd like to just give out about this particular thing. So with discovery, you could run these cheap experiments and find maybe much better ideas. So here's an example of a rolling wave forecast. What I like about it is it uses min-max. It doesn't use averages. We're trying to avoid the flaw of averages. So, really bad, we get this much done. Really good, we might get this much done. And you can do that in multiple time horizons. Time reference, what about the upsides? Upsides, and includes waiting time. It speaks the customer's language, which is time. It's really simple to do. But it does require you to have some reference items. And it is prone to abuse by people with a focus on keeping you busy. Hands up here if anybody here is using time reference for your sizing at the moment. Anyone using time sizing? One person there, thank you. Story points, the most popular approach, I would say. It does have some upsides. It gets a bit of a doing off, and including from people like me, quite honestly, but there are some things, like, for example, you can avoid bringing in elephants. It doesn't avoid it completely. You'll still discover something's too big after you start it. It could be used to limit work in progress. This is one of the things that ultimately, no matter what approach we use, our stakeholders are trying to convert it to time, aren't they? And within the team, we try to avoid that, but there are ways. I mean, ultimately, you will find out that a team can do between 30 and 60 points in a sprint, for example. So that's your range, and that you can convert that to time that way. But we don't try to go right down to one story point equals 1 day. That would be not recommended practice. It's got a lot of downsides, though. One of my clients in the last year and a half, tens of thousands of employees in the travel industry, there were a number of CIOs, and they reported to me that their velocity had doubled. The number of story points delivered across the entire company had doubled. Well, I'm also into Kanban, and I was looking at their flow, and I was using a tool called Kanbanize to analyze their flow. They were actually using Jira, managed to get the data across so I could get proper analysis on what was going on. And their throughput, the number of items they were finishing, halved. So I call it PS story points. Is this a medium or a large? Well, in this company, they were being measured on velocity. So guess which one it was? It was large, and sometimes it might have been extra large. And then it keeps going on. It's like a self-fulfilling thing. And sometimes I even call it story point bingo. I really lost all hope with story points. So my essential advice is avoid story points. In non-software, it can be more tricky. I do a lot of work in non-software the last 5 years. And there is a tendency there to use story points because you have different types of item. In software, you have one type of item, you build some software, you release it, you're done. In marketing, for example, you might be doing some packaging work and you might be doing some communications work. They're completely different types of item. You can't have a definition done for both of those that's the same. You just go to the lowest common denominator. And so there are some catches there, but I believe counting items is still possible. And what I found actually was there wasn't that much of a difference, even though the item types were quite different. So it's story points, avoid. T-shirt sizes, it doesn't require that much detail. You've got a lot of the upsides of story points here as well, but they end up getting converted into story points. So you're basically just getting the same downside that you get with story points if you're not careful with it. Wall estimation, slightly better in that you get your value divided by your effort. But what I find about wall estimation is the team starts off, they have their whole backlog on the wall, say they have a story map or they've got an impact map or just a plain linear one, but they just leave it there. That's it, it's one and done, and you're supposed to be redoing this. It's felt like it's a big thing, but actually in my experience, the last 6-7 years, any backlog, estimated effort in 20 minutes, the whole backlog using a wall estimation in 20 minutes. And you could do the same with value, a bit of conversation, an hour and 10 minutes later, the whole thing is sized. But it's still wrong. Estimates are always wrong. It's just giving you some kind of an idea of what's going on. You could also guesstimate. So you have a particular goal, there's something you want to achieve. How many items would that take? Oh, I think that might take between 5 stories and 15 stories. What? Well, yeah, if it's really simple, it could be 5. But if it's really difficult, it could be 15. You could do that with story points as well, of course. The good thing about this is you can actually use this for probabilistic forecasting. So imagine you've got a product backlog that's 50 items high. But it could get a lot bigger. It could go to 75 items. So with probabilistic forecasting, what you do is you say, okay, you're going to throw random numbers at this. So 50, 51, 52, never goes over 75, never goes to 76, never goes below 50, random numbers in here. And then you throw random numbers at how are we performing. You can do that with story points, you can also do it with number of items. It's better with number of items because they deliver value because of the BS story points we've talked about. But developers find it quite easy to ballpark those. When I was in a telecoms company in 2016, in a situation where we knew very little about what we needed to build, but there were people outside the door who wanted to know when we were going to deliver it, we were able to use this, and it actually did help us to get an initial forecast. Some downsides, people still prefer relative estimation. They can't let it go. It's kind of a thing. So it's almost like people need to see the items being counted. They need to see the charts and need to see, is that any better actually than the relative estimation? They won't believe you. And so it's kind of a journey for people to go on. So it's more like a psychological thing. So usually the only reason why I would stay with story points would be because the people aren't with me. I don't want to lose the dressing room, so I have to bring them on some kind of a thinking journey. Right sizing we've talked about already. It does have some downsides because some people misunderstand thinking that every item has to be the same size. They don't. They just need to be within our threshold. Your sprint is 2 weeks long. If your item is 2 days or 10 days, that's totally cool. And there's a disconnect as well in the Kanban community about how you do the forecasting. I've managed to find a kind of a tight walk through that, but it is something to be aware of. But if you are doing forecasting based on counting items, right-sized items, or using no estimates, if you have a situation like I had with a team here 3 years ago, where every items are being delivered on the last day of the sprint, that means your throughput most days is 0, nada, nothing. So when your random number generator is running, it's throwing zeros most of the time because you mostly do 0. And so the quality of your forecasts do go down if you're not delivering regularly. No estimates has lots of upsides, but in the wrong hands, and I sense what might happen. You give people any system and we tend to mess it up, don't we? And so you split those items down to 24-hour blocks. I have a feeling they'll end up being subtasks rather than examples of value delivery. That's my real worry with that. And the sad truth is that people prefer to be wrong than uncertain. And so it's not for everyone. Not everyone's cup of tea. I do like it, but you have to be careful about the culture that you're interacting with. So is estimation dead? There is some disparity between no matter what approach you use, how long will it take? So a guy called Stuart said to me one day in British Gas, he said, John, that's going to take about 10 minutes. But things are so crap around here, I'm going to say 3 days. That was actually a genius remark. He understood that there's very little correlation between our size of effort and how long things take. And there's a lot of kind of perceived wisdom about all the things you consider in terms of what's important, including complexity, by the way. But by far and above, the biggest factor is waiting time. How long are we going to be waiting? You have dependencies between teams, or you've got too much work in progress, whatever you're doing, waiting. Empirically, what we can see is well over 90% of how long something takes is actually waiting time. Sometimes over 95%. I actually saw 99% once. So be careful with your sizing. The more you're trying to get better estimates, you're just going to get this. I love this one-liner from Henrik Nieberg. 100% resource utilization equals 0% flow. So you need to make sure you've got good flow in your system, you're not taking on too much work. About forecasts, if you are routinely correct with your forecasts, we think you're a freak of nature, because there's so many things that can go wrong. Waiting time. Even me, if I want to paint the fence at home, something really straightforward, it's not even complex, I even suck at estimating that. So whatever about doing complex things. Lack of focus, changing priorities. We talked about Monte Carlo. This is a visual example here where some of your stakeholders, they might be very uncomfortable with some of the charts here, like the histogram, or they might be uncomfortable with these line charts and saying, what the hell is this going on? Like, why is he showing me this? But everybody understands the calendar control. They can say, 85% chance I could deliver by that date. That means 15% chance I won't be delivered by that date. And the very, very important phrase after that is, but I will give you a better forecast next week. I've just told you I don't know, because I don't know. In the complex space, we don't know. It's smoke and mirrors. But I'd rather do this regularly in a culture where saying you don't know is a problem. I'd rather show something regular. And then our stakeholders will get used to the idea, hang on a second, that date keeps changing. Yeah, dude, it's like the weather. Oh. So we're trying to, instead of managing expectations about dates, we're kind of moving towards managing expectations about uncertainty. So some options then. Do you estimate, or do you use data? Some options for estimating. In Kanban, they have a thing called a service level expectation. At the start, they've got no data. But somebody guesses, we think we can get a single item done in 20 days or less. I would say that's a poor quality forecast for a single item. It's just a guess. You could also use individual item sizing. We've seen the pros and cons of the various options, and it's probably not going to be a sad answer, probably not going to be the happy side of that answer. You could guesstimate the number of items. You could say 90% for this particular product goal, 90% confident, 10% chance that I'm wrong, that it's going to be between 50 and 75 items. If somebody says it might be 35 and someone says it might be 77, I'm going to go with those. You could also do the same with story points, and I've had some mediocre results with that. And you could also use story points and averages, and the reason that's red is because it's based on average. Plan on average, you could succeed on average, but you could also fail on average. 50-50 heads or tails, boss? I don't think so. Okay. So, believe it or not, I'm actually a fan of guesstimating the number of items. And I'm also a fan of guesstimating the performance of the team. Because you can use data, but the problem with data is you need up to 11 samples for the data to be 90% confident that it gives you a good forecast. Do I really want to include data from 11 sprints ago to forecast how I'm doing at the moment? I hope I've been improving, right? And so I find that I do get better forecasts, believe it or not, but you have to say 90% chance you're right, 10% chance you're wrong. You have to be careful with the limits. If you got the wrong limits, you got the wrong forecast. You can also use data. The more data, the better. A lot of the times I don't have data, just starting out, and so I used the guesstimate ranges. And here again, I'm kind of going for, you could use data based on a single item, or you could have throughput for multiple items. These are all fine and well, and there are some good things about them. But ultimately, we're still measuring things, and people could game these things. Whatever you do, I mean, even counting items, are they going to be real items, or are they going to be fake items? Are they going to be just subtasks, or are we actually going to have real value? So what I really prefer is that you manage expectations about uncertainty, not dates. And really what you should be saying is, we're using an empirical approach, operating one sprint at a time, and the sprint goal is not even a guarantee. The real answer is we need to start and learn quickly. And maybe you can do some now, next, later kind of thing, but even then we put in lots of question marks on that because we're not really sure. Woody Zuhl is more a fan of the one on the right. He's the guy who came up with mob programming in Hunter Industries, now called ensemble programming, I believe. And he says, why don't you just be agile? Don't manage expectations at all. Let people go see. I mean, isn't this really agile? Discover and deliver capabilities and review the outcomes of customers and then learn what can be learned and then act on what we've discovered. Why are we trying to predict what we're going to do in the next sprint? We haven't even got a clue what's going to happen in this sprint. And I mentioned to you earlier as well, I'll say it again, 60 to 90% of items, in my estimation, you should never build. There was a guy I trained at a leadership class 3 years ago in London. He said, John, he worked in the operations department of this telecoms company, and his job was to put stuff into production. And he said, John, I take stuff out of production. I said, what? I take stuff out of production. I said, well, what happens when people notice that you took it out of production? He said, nobody notices. Oh, actually, sorry, once somebody noticed, and I just put it back in. He said, sorry, and I put it back in. Marty Kagan reckons it's 90%. Standish Group Chaos Report, 2/3 of features rarely or never used. I'm kind of 60 to 90, that kind of range. And when I do lots of experimentation, I discover that. But I also discover that even when people experiment, there's still execution bias. You still follow what you believe, even if the data is telling you that you should be turning, you should be pivoting. So it does really require a lot of discipline. There are some approaches as well to still criticize these, but before I get to that, the key takeaways: avoid story points, avoid counting non-valuable items, including items that aren't actually done, avoid use of averages, consider historical reference items, believe it or not. Try probabilistic forecasting, either using guesstimate ranges with sensible confidence intervals. It's very important that we ask the question. Also try it with real data. Try no estimates, but really promote being agile. For complex work, promote managing expectations about uncertainty over managing expectations about dates. It's not all going forward. Some work does need to be reworked. Some techniques to challenge this: Dave Snowden has 2 of these, future backwards, ritual descent. Whatever forecast you have, it's useful to get people to really feel safe about trying to find holes in your forecast. You think 85% chance you can deliver all this work by the 14th of March 2023, but we do some ritual descent where people actually get permission to be really vocal about how they're not really supporting this. And that might flush out some really nice insights about, oh, okay, maybe let's relook at our forecast. Do we have the right ranges? So make sure you check your forecast. Make sure you use some kind of technique to really be a little bit pessimistic to challenge. It's nice to be optimistic with your forecast, but it's also good to try and poke some holes in it as well, because we are going to be trying to manage expectations based on these. Thank you very much. There's more options as well in the back of the deck. Thank you.